Hey GIFX friends, once again we're looking at the beautiful M-Audio Venom synthesizer. I know I've made a few videos about this one before, but I really wanted to talk just one last time about some of the complexities of the operating system, because it's certainly not an intuitive thing. I'm not saying I know it inside out, but let's take a closer look and I'll show you what I can. First of all, this array of controls right here, you can see there's a bit of a reflection from a light on the ceiling. That's a big problem with this highly glossy surface, and also you might not even be able to see through this camera, but there is actually writing on each of the grey lines. So the grey on white, that's reasonably easy to see, but the grey on grey, that's virtually impossible to see, so you have to get the lighting just right when you're playing this keyboard. Once you are in a slightly better position, you'll be able to read exactly what's going on, and it works like your usual array. You just scroll down, you've got your rows and columns. Each dial will affect whatever is in that particular row. Having said that, it's not always simple. So say we did want to change the LFO1 rate, for example. You might turn that and find that absolutely nothing's happening. You've got to remember that this and most synthesizers will run many waveforms at once. And the particular waveform you've got selected on the other side of the machine, which I'll show you in a moment, might only have a very, very small effect or might have no LFO associated with it, so you might hear no difference. And this is just one example of knowing exactly where you're at with this keyboard. It's quite hard sometimes to understand in the system exactly what it is you're controlling. And to be honest, you'll often just randomly stumble across patches that you find are quite good. Note on the end here too that in this final column you've just got an on-off switch. Sometimes that on-off switch will cycle through several options or effects, for example right at the bottom right here, that will cycle through a series of effects. On the other side here, again, it's kind of user-friendly. You got your master value control knob there, you can see the patches changing as I turn that. And over here you can see the 4 channels that make up each of the multi-patches. So if I play the lower end of the keyboard, okay, we hear a bit of a rhythm there, and you can see the lights flashing, and the rhythm of those lights will give you an idea of which is controlling which. So one is drums and one is bass, and you should be able to see which is which. So to me it looks like that one's bass, and that's the way it's usually laid out. Drums, bass, and a couple of the single pads running over here. This is currently in select mode, so we can select one of our 4 tracks, if you want to call them that, while this LED is illuminated. Again, the print very, very hard to see. We've got kind of silvery grey on a grey background. I don't know why M-Audio did it that way, but there you go. This is a cyclic button, so we've got 3 modes. One is mute, where selecting a button will mute any particular track so that you can have a clear listen to whatever is remaining. Then you've got enable, so some multi-patches won't require all of these. So in this case we've got 3 layers of sound happening, but I can go up to 4 if I want to, or I could have just 1. Or 0, I suppose. Not that there'd be any point in that. And if I press bank, we'll go from A to B to C to D. Each of them I think has something like 128. Yep, 128 times 4 banks. Over on the other side of your screen we've got 4 more buttons with very hard to see functions. The one with the stripes is the store button, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment because it's a little bit confusing as well. Then we've got a pattern button here where we can select drum patterns, multi-patches and single patches. The multis, of course, being ones that have drums, an arpeggio, a bass line, and all sorts of complex things going on, whereas the single patches are just single sounds right through the whole continuum of the keyboard in the classic piano style. So pulling back a little bit, we've got our first patch, Venomous. An amazing and pretty intense patch, and very typical of the Venom's brilliant sounds. Let's try a little bit of editing. On the 4th row here we've got attack, decay, sustain and release, which are time-honoured old friends in synthesis. And right at the end here we've got our poly and mono switch. Generally mono is great for soloing because you can switch very easily between notes and your playing can sound very, very fast and fluid, which is great. But if you switch over to poly, that'll give us access to chords. Let's see if we can make this patch a little less insane, which is a battle you'll find yourself fighting a lot with this keyboard. So there's an example of turning dials and getting no result. I assumed that there was some distortion in that patch, so I've turned the effect send 1 and 2 right down to 0, but we're still very distorted. Let's try a more conservative patch. Okay, a nice bass sound. Monophonic, of course, as is often the case with bass sounds, because when you play chords in bass it can get a little bit muddy. But again, without any specific goal in mind, let's fool around kind of randomly. And we'll use our switch over here to change that to a poly pad. Maybe give it a bit more release so that it fades out nicely. And we've got our effects on the bottom row. The button now will switch us through which effects we've got to choose from. And if you find that your editing is going nowhere, you can just switch out of the pad and switch back into it again, and it'll be back at its defaults. I accidentally switched out of it just then as I was playing, so if we go back again, we're back again at our original. But let's say we have made some changes. I'll just make something that sounds significantly different. To save that, I have to move back to the mode panel in the center here. I mentioned before that we had a store button, and note that we are on a single patch here. One continuous sound. We press store and then it asks to store what? See, I'm used to keyboards just storing everything when you press store, usually with a double click of that button. But on this occasion you have to actually store what you've made, so you've got to press the single patch there to answer that question, store what, and then press store again, then we're saved. So I've got NAS bass with that higher pitch sound added. If I go up to 11, different sound. And back again, I'm still saved. If you press store and then store again, you'll go out, play some other patches and return, and you'll find that everything's returned back to the default. And I've got to tell you, that had me confused for quite a long time. Okay, now let's edit a multi-patch. We'll start by finding one that we like. Sounds pretty good. If we choose our pattern button up here, it'll show us what drum pattern is currently selected. Again, we've got 127 I think to choose from, so if we play our pattern, although I have just realized, and this is a common mistake, that I've got the bass line selected, not the drum pattern. So what we've got to do is get down to our select layer here, choose the drum pattern, and now we should hear some changes in drums. I'm just going to mute that bass by going to the mute top LED here, select bass as a muted sound. Let's find something a bit more logical for the moment. There we go, that's something we can work with. I'll flick down to select again over here, and we'll come off drums because we're happy with what we've got, and we'll get back to the bass line. Remembering of course that I muted that a moment ago, so back to the top, unmute the drums, back down to select, and we should hear some bass now. And because we selected the bass track, we're choosing the bass pattern. That one's quite interesting. Remember of course that for both of these tracks we can still go over in that direction and use those knobs to change the various parameters in our rows and columns there as well. When we press our bass button again, we'll see what bass sound that we've got for this particular multi-patch. So let's play the rhythm again. And we can choose any sound to play that bass line. That one's pretty good. And of course, even though some of them won't work as bass lines, you can often stumble across something that's quite good. Let's leave it on mondo. Because that bass line is a rhythmic arpeggio that will follow the keys that we press, like this, we can switch arpeggio off and play our bass line completely manually. I like to leave it on because I'm a bad keyboard player. If we have a look at our upper keys, again, the arpeggio is affecting that. But if we want to switch that arpeggio off, we do have to remember to select the actual part that we're playing. And arpeggio off. Arpeggio 1. So guys, that's a quick rundown of what I've worked out about the M-Audio Venom. The manual is pretty good, but I do like to just dive in and just try things out and see what comes up and sounds great. Everybody knows too, or everybody who's read about it knows, that this keyboard does get a lot more out of the software that comes with it, but that's a subject for another video. I'll just close off by demonstrating how strange these two controls are here, pitch bend and modulation. You'll find by default they're almost always set to control something other than pitch bend and modulation. Have a listen to this. So that's just controlling a kind of a ring modulation over the rhythm only, and that can give you some really great fills and some very interesting rhythmic changes. So I'm certainly not saying I don't like it, I'm just saying that you'll often find that it's not actually pitch bend and modulation at all. It tends to be a little bit more predictable on the upper end of the keyboard where your melodic tracks are selected. Well, it's made a liar of me again there because it's controlling different parameters again. Okay, I think that's changing sustain or something like that, and this one is filtering the sound as well as adding a little bit of modulation. So it's just surprises all the time with the Venom, and for that reason alone I think it's really worth owning. I think it's about the most exciting synthesizer I've ever played, and you know from watching Gear Facts how many I've reviewed in my time. Anyway, thanks as always for liking, commenting or subscribing, guys. I'd like to go into more depth about the Venom, but of course we'd just be here all day, wouldn't we? I hope that gives you a good place to start. Here are some links to some other things that might interest you, including one or two other videos that I've made about the Venom. Okay, so that's all for now. I'll see you next time on Gear Facts.